Good evening, everyone. Today we are at Deuteronomy Chapter 5. However, yesterday, because of time, we had one small paragraph that we actually left out so that we will complete that today and then we'll continue with Chapter 5 because they are interconnected. The part that we have left out is actually from verse 44, and this is one section which is a preface to chapter 5. Now, in chapter 4, verse 44, it says this, and this is the law. And by the word law, you should know that it is Torah, and that means the instructions. And this is what God gave to Moses, and Moses set it before, or basically put it in front of him. Before is to their face. Now, if you recall, I have been always mentioning that the Hebrew language is very vivid. It's all action-oriented. Even the word before in the English is actually literally put it to their face before the children of Israel, so they cannot ignore or they cannot say, I didn't know. And basically, these are all action words that is saying, here, it's in your face. This is the law of God. And in verse 45, it says, these are the testimonies. Now, the word testimony here, like the Ark of the Testimony, where it speaks about what it represents, what the Ark represents. So testimony, it means witness. This is the witness. What about the witness? The idea of witness in this case is something that keeps coming back to remind them. That's the intent of this idea of testimony, that it is to be in their face, that they are always reminded, made aware. And the statutes, the idea of statutes are ordinances, the boundaries. And then the judgments or the decisions or the consequences would be a good word to use. The consequence. So you are duly reminded to do whatever that was told in the Torah, in the law here. They are boundaries that you do not exceed. And if you do, there are consequences. And these are what Moses spoke to the children of Israel after they came out of Egypt. So when they were in Egypt, they don't know about the Torah. They received this at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. And it says, after they came out of Egypt, on this side of the Jordan, which is the east, because Moses is still there with them, opposite the valley opposite Bet Peor, in the land of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, whom Moses and the children of Israel defeated after they came out of Egypt. Now, there's a lot of details left out of here, and you will have read this in chapter 3. The beginnings of the possession that would be in the land of King Sihon. And later, they took possession of the land of Og, king of Bashan, the two kings of the Amorites who were on this side of the Jordan toward the rising sun, or rising of the sun, which tells us this is east. This is more a picturesque way of describing the east. So there are many words that describe east, if you recall, right? The front describe the east. The rising of the sun is a vivid description of the east. So this is very much on the eastern shore, so that there is no ambiguity. Moses is still there. They're talking about all the recollection of the events. And there were two particular events, the one with Sihon and Og. And these were the two Amorite kings, and they took over the land. And they allocated the land out from Aroea in the bank of River Arnon, even to Mount Sion. Now, in verse 48, this word is Sion, and this is not Zion, right? That we know in Jerusalem. This is Mount Sion, and it says this is also with another name, Mount Hermon, and this would be the border, the northern border of the land of Israel that we eventually come to know. Now, Mount Hermon is the tallest peak in the entire mountain range called the Mountains of Israel. And all the plain on the east side of the Jordan River, as far as the Sea of the Arava. Sea of the Arava is the Salt Sea. And that would also be today known as the Dead Sea. Below the slopes of Pisgah. And we read about Pisgah in the later parts of Deuteronomy, which is where God brought Moses to look at the promised land at a place called Nebo, right? Mount Nebo, which is actually at the slopes of Pisgah. And that's the mountainside at the eastern side of the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. Now that recollection is completed. And in chapter 5, Moses called all Israel. You need to remember the word all Israel are the 12 tribes. There were the tribes of Reuben and Gad that were already given their inheritance. Half the tribe of Manasseh was given inheritance, but the condition was that they all must join together, at least the men, will continue to fight across the Jordan. And at this point in time, there is now a recount, a recollection of something called the law. This is extremely important. So we should pay attention. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak to your hearing today, that you may learn them and be careful to observe them." These are all very key verbs. The word here, remember, it is the Shema. The Shema. Hear, O Israel, and we'll see that again in chapter 6. This is called the Shema. It says, "Hear, O Israel." This is the boundaries. And then these are the judgments and the justice or the decisions that we'll make, which I, in this case, Moses, is going to speak. And this is the verb form of the word davar. In your hearing today. This means in your ears today. If you remember, Hebrew is very vivid. Hearing is describing a verb. However, the vividness here is about the literal ears, that whatever Moses is saying, it is in their ears. And that means they cannot ignore. And that you may learn. Now, this word learn is actually lamad. And this is learning by goading. The intensive form would be teaching, right? And learning is to learn new things, to learn what to do. And to teach would be the intensive form of learning, because after you learn, you can actually teach using a stick. And then it says, be careful. Be careful means to guard. To observe is to do. So you notice there are two words here. One is to guard. To guard means to keep, to make sure you remember and you have to pass it down to the next generation. But the second one is to do. To observe in the English here means to do. That you are not only to know them, but you're going to do something about them. And so, like a parent, when you teach your children, pick up the toys, it is not only to hear, but to actually do it. And so the doing part is important. Verse 2. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. And remember, this is Sinai. Now, in verse 3, there is a reminder that the Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers. Remember who the fathers are? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The covenant was actually made with us. And by us would be the nation, because this is made starting in Exodus chapter 19. And it includes all of those who are here today, all of us who are alive. So you can't say that the covenant is just one generation who died. It is with the entire nation, and that generation who died was the one who represented all time those descendants of theirs. The Lord talked with you face to face on the mountain in the midst of the fire. Remember, yesterday we talked about the fire as well, the lightning. And the idea of face to face is you can actually hear God. Is as close as that, right in front of you before the Mount Sinai. And then I stood between the Lord and you. And so Moses took the role of the middleman and declared to you the word of the Lord, so that when God spoke to Moses, and then Moses speaks to the children of Israel, and that was the role that Moses took between the Lord and you. And the reason that he mentioned is that you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up the mountain, and God didn't let them anyways. They're not supposed to come anywhere near. And this is what God said. Now, this is a recap of Exodus chapter 20. And if you recall, when we started in Deuteronomy chapter 1, I had mentioned to you that there was this new generation of Israelites, those who were below 20 when they left Egypt, and those who were born in the wilderness, because that first generation who left Egypt of 20 and above decided against the instructions of God not to go and take the promised land. And so God faulted them and prohibited them from entering. And so they didn't die instantly. And God preserved them. And over 40 years, they all died. And now, at this juncture, towards the end of the life of Moses, Moses brings back Exodus 20 again. And hence the Greek name Deuteronomy means the second law, or the second giving of the law. But, ultimately, God only gave the law once. And as God gave the law once, God wrote it twice, because the first time it broke. Well, it's not to give two sets of laws, but it's to give the same set of laws. And God only have one set. For who? For us. Who is the us? Very important. The new generation of the nation of Israel. And so let's begin. We begin from here. In verse 6. All right, in verse 6. I am the Lord, your God. And literally it means Anochi Yehovah Eloheka. These are familiar words, because if you learn your Hebrew, these are words that's always said, because it gives such an impact and authority in the words. It's God speaking. I am Yehovah, your Elohim. And what did I do? I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And yesterday we saw that was the iron pot of Egypt. I brought you out. What do you mean I brought you out? And the idea here is I took you out. I let you out. Right? Let you out, and the focus is out. Out of the land of Egypt. Out of the house of bondage. Now, I don't quite like this word, bondage. I think this word is better represented as servitude. That they were in a case of servanthood. Now, I know some people would like to emphasize and build on the word slave, but unfortunately, in our day and age, the word slave has a very negative connotation. And so the idea of servitude and servanthood basically means that towards the end of their stay in Egypt, they had to listen without much of an option to their masters. And God says, I now have taken you out of this land. You are no longer a servant of Egypt. That's what it means. I took you out of the land of Egypt where you were a servant. So let's take the word bondage out. That you were a servant to them, right? In the house where you lived. Where you lived, you became a servant of the powers of Egypt. Now that you have left Egypt, the flip side of verse 6 is that I have brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of servanthood, to become my servants. And this is important for us to understand in the implication to become my servants. They are not brought out of the land of Egypt to go on a holiday trip. They were brought out of the land of Egypt to reestablish the fact that there is a peculiar relationship with Jehovah, their God, or your God in that sense. And this chapter, where we call the 10 Commandments, or in chapter 3 calls the 10 words, or the 10 Devarim, or the 10 statements, is to declare to them not specifically the law, but specifically who God is through the understanding of these instructions. And so he says, you shall have no other gods. And this word here is upon my face, or how should we say, towards my face. That's what it means. No other Elohim. And we saw that yesterday. God was very specific about idolatry. And in verse 8 describes that idolatry of carved images. And that seems to be an entire import from chapter 4. Any likeness. In verse 8, you shall not make yourself anything of form. Right? Any image. Basically, any image. The second part here, and the word any likeness comes in one chunk, right? And the carved image of any likeness of anything that is in the skies above, on the land beneath, or on the water under the land. You shall not bow down. In verse 9, the idea is bow down. And it's shakach, right? Shakach. And it's usually translated as worship, but in this case, it is translated as bow down, all the way down. You do not bow to any of them, because when you bow to them, you are acknowledging that they are greater than you. Or worse, they are greater than Jehovah, your God. And you do not serve them. You don't do anything for them, because in the pagan idolatry, the priest will tell you what to do. And human nature being is that they need to respond to a greater authority. And so God says, I am your greater authority. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And we saw that yesterday. One that is like a mother bird trying to protect her chicks from being taken away from others. So the way that God guards his people is by giving them the Torah. Visiting. Now the word visit here, actually visit is a good word, but the idea of visit really is to attend to. Attend to. That God will come and do something. Pay you a visit is not a nice thing in a negative sense. The iniquity, and by iniquity, it would be avon, right? Avon. The avon of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. Now, all of these would say that when they have other gods, that is hating God. You're turning away from God to another God. And when you do that, God will come and visit this iniquity. Now, what do you mean by God visiting or disciplining or judging? The iniquity, the perversion of their faith, of praying and worshiping and bowing to other gods. Well, we find that in the later books, in the prophet books, that they were taken away. They were removed from the land, the northern kingdom first and then the southern kingdom. That would be what God is saying. If you worship other idols, I will come and discipline you. And if I come and discipline you, the rest of the generations who have followed you will be suffering the consequences. But he says, I will show mercy to thousands. Now, the idea of mercy is hesed. Loving kindness would be a good way. Loving kindness. And this is another attribute of God. God is a jealous God. God is a merciful God. God has loving kindness. God is using his Torah to demonstrate to them who he is. That he means business. These are not 10 suggestions. This is the 10 commandments. This is not 10 options. These are the 10 statements, the 10 issues that God wants to deal with them. And that how will God give his mercy? It is conditional. And so we know that God is a conditional God. To those who love me, and then it says here, to keep my commandments. And this is to guard, right? To guard. To love is to give of oneself to God. And we'll see that in the next chapter. And so only those who love God will receive mercy. Now you may wonder, why does God need people to love him before he shows mercy? And he's demonstrating that he is a kind of logical God. He is a kind of a faithful God. He will not bless people who have done bad. And if those who have done bad, who hate God, who has iniquity like this, who has iniquity, who hates God, all they will get is God visiting them with anger, God visiting them with strong, intense punishment, even removing them from the land. But God will show chesed to thousands, to all of them, I would say, to the thousands, the many of them, but God actually knows not everyone is going to love God, right? In the nation, there will be many who will, but not all. Now, going on to the next point is verse 11. And this says, you shall not take the name of the Lord. And you'll be surprised. The word take here is to lift. Why did we translate as take? Well, it makes sense in the English to say take. But the actual fact is to lift up, right? To lift up the name of the Lord. The name, the Shem of Jehovah, your God. And the idea of vanity here means falsely or pretentiously, to make it worthless, right? To, how should else we say, to lie about the name of God. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the name of God is a very Hebrew phrase. It's not a Western phrase. The name of God, or the Shem of God, speaks about the character of God. And so God tells them, don't bear my character falsely. Don't bear the character of God worthlessly. Don't lie in our character to pretend that this is God's character. See, God is interested for us to know him, and for the Israelites to know him, that the name of God is not just Jehovah, your God. The name of God in the Hebrew sense very much talks about the character. And so it's not about just merely pronouncing. And when the Jews talk about pronouncing, they will call it the ineffable name of God. So you don't pronounce it. That's not the point. The more important aspect would be, don't take the character of God. Don't bear the character of God. Let us not walk around to misrepresent the character of God. That's what he's saying here. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless. The idea of guiltless means innocent, which means that this is a double negation. Not guiltless means will not hold him innocent if he lives, right? If he lifts up God's name in vain. And so God is giving a judgment here. Is this important? Obviously it is important. And it has to do not with the sound and the pronunciation, but it has to do with character that people can see. And now in verse 12, he speaks about the Shabbat. And the word observe here, well, in Exodus chapter 20, it says remember. And in this case, it's to keep. And the idea of keep is to make sure that you don't forget. Pass it down to the next generation. To remember means to recall, bring to mind. Don't ignore it. Don't forget about it. Observe talks about remembering by passing down to the next generation. The truth of the Shabbat needs to be maintained, to keep it holy. Now, the word keep it holy means to be special. Keep the Sabbath day. Remember, guard the Sabbath day to make it special. Why? Because God created the world in 6 days. And on the seventh day, which is the Shabbat, is a rest. That the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you labor, do everything you want to do your occupation. The seventh day is the Shabbat of Jehovah your God. In it you do no work. Not you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your ox, donkey. These are animals of labor. nor your cattle, nor your ger, your stranger, which is within your gates, who live among you. Your male servant, your female servant may rest as well as you. So, what is the intent? It is to rest. Now, understand this, the significance of the Shabbat is not merely to rest, but to recognize the special day of rest and to recognize that God is the God who made the world. And remember, that's the second thing about the Shabbat, that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Now, in verse 15, the idea of the word slave, which I don't quite like, if you're a servant, you have to listen to your master in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out of there. Look at this. By a mighty hand, by a strong hand, right? Like Hezekiah, a mighty hand. This is in Exodus chapter 19 and 20. And by an outstretched arm. The outstretched arm is the arm that will help and sustain. And the mighty hand is a power to guide and to lead. And so you look at this as an A and a B. Two different ways of approaching it, but they are talking about how God, in his great almighty power, was able to lead them, guide them, pull them out as a friend. And therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And so each time they keep the Sabbath, they remember the creation of the world rested on the seventh day. And they are also now, in addition to Genesis chapter 2, would be Exodus chapter 20 and 21. And that is the time when they rest. They don't shake leg and watch TV. They actually sit around to talk and discuss and to reflect. And each generation will do that with regards to Genesis chapter 2, as well as Exodus chapter 14 and 15. Now in verse 16, you will find that it is to honor your father and mother. Now the father and mother is a family unit. In Genesis chapter 2, God says, and the man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife. And the man and wife, the man and woman, when they cleave together, they start the new family as the mother and father, the father and mother. And this is important. So recognize this as the institution, the core institution of the fabric of Israelite society. That the Lord your God has commanded you, and this is a must, this is not an option, that your days may be long and may be well with you in the land which God is giving you. And so when you go into the land, there are conditions. Remember, God is a conditional God. God isn't going to say, well, whatever you do, I'll close two eyes and everything will be fine. God says, when you are obedient to me, when you love me, when you honor your father and mother as you should, because they raised you. And then God says, well, that is a good thing, and I will let you live in the land for a long period of time. Verse 17 speaks of you shall not murder, and this would be premeditated. Intentional. And so yesterday we saw that if it was not intentional, it was not premeditated, it was accidental, they could actually run to the eastern shore of the Jordan and find 3 cities of refuge, which they are to hide. You shall not commit adultery. And in the Hebrew sense, adultery is with a married woman. Right? This is in the Hebrew terms. You shall not steal. Don't secretly take from other people something that doesn't belong to you. You shall not bear false witness. against your neighbor. False witness would be, how should we say, uh, a lying testimony. That would be a better way of looking at false witness. Don't lie in your testimony, because in the under this environment, the eyewitness testimony is paramount because it leads on to a judgment. And if there is a lie in the testimony, then someone innocent will suffer. And God says you cannot cause an innocent person to suffer. And only the one who is guilty, absolutely guilty, in the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, that it shall establish the judgment. And so testimony is important because it's about your neighbor, the people you're working with, you're living with. You shall not covet. This would be desire, right? What else can you call? You shall not long to make your own. And what does this mean? You look at your neighbor's wife and you want to make her your own. And that is a different angle of talking about adultery. You shall not desire your neighbor's house. You look at it, oh, it's very nice tent. Let me take it from him. His field, his male servant, female servant. So you owe me money. Let me take everything from you. And so that would be what God doesn't want. And we saw that as in a form of injustice in the later part of the nation of Israel. His ox, his donkey, these are the animals as worth something because they are animals of labor, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And this talks about ownership. What don't belong to you, don't take. That's basically it. And these words, the words, Devarim, is in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. These are the issues, these are the statements that the Lord spoke to all your assembly. The idea of assembly is that it means the congregation. Is that all of them actually gathered together. And when did they gather together? In the mountain, from the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness, with a loud voice. And this is the whole episode of Exodus chapter 19. Now, we have seen Exodus chapter 19 repeated 3 or 4 times in these 5 chapters. What does that tell you? It's incredibly important. So go back and study that. And he added no more. Now, what do you mean by added? In chapter 3, it says, you shall not add. Add, and that would be adding to the importance, adding to the number. And that means that God has spent the whole time on the Mount Sinai to give Moses all of these things, right? All of these. And it was for a while that Moses was up in the mountain. And God wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And that is what we call the tablets of stone, the tablets of testimony, or what we normally call the 10 commandments. And so it was when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness while the mountain was burning, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. Remember, that is how they communicate. And it's all in an organization tear down. Well, Moses can't speak to 2 million people. And so Moses needs to speak to the heads of the tribes and your elders that they have appointed. And you said, surely the Lord your God has shown us his glory and his greatness. They have seen the fire, they've seen the smoke, they've heard the voice of God. Wow, we have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. Well, this day, God speaks with man like them, and he lives. So now that we've heard God and we are still alive, then why should we die? We don't want to see him any more of this. And so the great fire will consume us if we hear the voice of God some more. Then we will die. So we don't want to die. For who of all flesh has heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of fire, as we have and lived? This is important because this is about hearing, and it is about hearing the voice of God, and they have done that and they are still alive. And so you go near to Moses, you hear everything that God says, and then you come back and tell us, and we will hear it and do it. And this was the culmination of Exodus chapter 24. It says, we hear you and we will do it. That is the crucial part. Why? Because that was like the sign of a marriage, if you recall. It is so crucial that, it's like saying, I do to God. Everything you say, we do. Verse 28. Then the Lord heard the voice of your words when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the voice of the words of these people, and they have spoken to you, and they are right. Well, in verse 28, the idea of right means good. Now you'll be wondering, well, is good? This is tov, right? Tov means good, tov means right, tov means agreeable. God is agreeable in all that they have articulated. I think the word spoken is not as good as articulated. They have said a lot of things that is not recorded. They had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. And the word forever is olam. And so God is looking at them there in Exodus chapter 24. And yes, they have the heart. They have made such decisions that they will fear God. They are so afraid of going any nearer to God and say to Moses, you go and listen for us. And God is saying, I am convinced that they will always keep or guard, right, all my commands, and that it may be well with them. And the idea well is tov, and with their children forever. It says, go say to them, return to your tents. Now the word return is actually a longer, it is the word shuv. And word go is to walk. Walk and say to them, go back to your tents where you came from. But as for you, stand here by me, and I will speak to you all the commandments. So God spoke to Moses for an extended period. The statutes, the judgments which you shall teach them, that they may observe them in the land which I'm giving them to possess. Remember in the last part in chapter 4, verses 45 onwards, that's this summary. Therefore, you shall keep and do, right? Keep and make. That's what it means. As the Lord your God has commanded you, when your parents tell you to pick up the toys, you just do as you're told. And this is what God expected of them, that I have given you these instructions, you just go and do them, that you shall not turn aside. The idea of turning aside to the right or to the left is going to the left side or going to the right side, and that means that they are departing from the way. And so that is not what God wants. God wants them to watch where they are going and keep walking in the way of God. That you should walk in all the ways which the Lord has commanded you. Walk straight, walk exactly what God has said, that you may live. This is a very interesting word. You may live. Verse 33, that you may be alive. Continue to live. And this really gives us an indication of the life to come as well. It will be tov with you. And that you may extend your days in the land which you possess. And so notice, conditional. God is a conditional God. Do good. Don't do bad. Judgment. Good blessings. And so God responds to what they do. And so in conclusion, this is a nutshell of the book of Deuteronomy, how God gave the law to the first generation, and now it's being spoken again to the next generation, those who were innocent at that time. And now they have grown up and they are listening well to Moses. They did not see everything in the land of Israel, but on behalf of them, the fathers were to tell the children what to do with regards to the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the way that God has taught them which day do what. And all of these are to be guarded to pass down to the next generation. And with this, we now come to a close of chapter 5, where we have covered the giving of the law one more time to the children of Israel.